What became of Richard Winters' best friend, the hard-drinking Captain Lewis Nixon, after World War II? And band of brothers. Lewis Nixon, who is portrayed by actor Ron Livingston, is depicted as being a deeply loyal, sharp-witted alcoholic who expresses near constant indifference. No matter the situation, the real Richard Winters said that Lewis Nixon was one of only two men who he never saw show fear in combat, the other being Ronald Spears. Of course, it's reasonable to conclude that this might have been in part due to the fact that Lewis Nixon was intoxicated much of the HL time, in addition to the fact that as a battalion S2 or intelligence officer, he was seldom in the thick of battle. In fact, Lewis Nixon didn't fire his rifle a single time in combat during the war. To fully understand who Lewis Nixon was after World War II, it's important to first understand his life prior to the war. Lewis Nixon was born on September 30, 1918 in New York City to Stanhope and Doris Nixon. He was one of three children. He had a younger brother named Fletcher, who was born in 1922, and sadly died when he was just 8 weeks old. His sister Blanche was born in 1923. Lewis Nixon grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. His family owned Nixon Nitration Works in New Jersey, a company that was founded in 1915 by his grandfather, naval architect and shipbuilder Lewis Nixon. The company's main function was making gunpowder and other materials for European nations during World War II. In the years that followed the war, the company focused on manufacturing cellulose, nitrate, the first man-made plastic, which was highly flammable. It was used in tubing for pencils and pens, covers for eyeglass frames, and sheets for playing cards. Such a business didn't come without risk in 1924. A massive explosion rocked the factory, claiming the lives of 20 people and injuring approximately 100 others. 40 buildings were destroyed in the blast, which made up much of the tiny industrial town of Nixon, New Jersey, which is today Edison, New Jersey. The explosion could be felt in Brooklyn and 50 mi away in Manola, New York. It became referred to as the Nixon Nitration Works disaster. There's even a Wikipedia page dedicated to it. The family rebuilt the company on the same site. Lewis Nixon spent his early childhood in both Manhattan and the family estate in New Jersey. When he was 12, the Nixons moved to an estate in Mono, California, where he lived until adulthood. He graduated from the prestigious Cate School, a strict boarding school near Santa Barbara. He then attended Yale University for 2 years, studying engineering. He also took summer courses in engineering at MIT. He returned to work at Nixon Nitration Works before enlisting in the Army at Fort Dix, New Jersey on January 14, 1941. By that point, Lewis Nixon was a hard-drinking 22-year-old party boy who had already traveled across Europe visiting England, France, and Germany. He even spent a year when he was 10 living in a villa that his family owned in France called Villa FZ, which is located in the Côte d'Or region. Years later, Lewis would inherit the villa and lease it to the Kennedy family. In the 1950s, newspaper reports revealed that he then tried to sell it. In 1957, Lewis Nixon had come from a long history of military service, up to and including his own service in World War II. His family members had fought in every war since the Revolution. In fact, he is a direct descendant of George Washington's Chief of Staff General Andrew Louise, an important figure in the Revolution, and one of the founders of Richmond, Virginia. His great-grandfather, Colonel Lafayette, would fought in the Mexican War. In the War of 1812, his grandfather, Lewis Nixon, fought in the Spanish-American War, and his father Stanhope Nixon was a lieutenant in World War I. For Lewis, military service was almost a family rite of passage. Lewis Nixon completed basic training at Camp Croft in South Carolina on December 20, 1941, almost a year after he enlisted in the Army. He married Stanford graduate Catherine Page in New York City. The couple had a son, Michael, who was born on October 27, 1943, after Lewis had already embarked for England with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. As seen in Band of Brothers, Catherine later informed Lewis that she was divorcing him via a letter he received while he was still overseas in the war. In the episode Why We Fight, in a rare moment when he loses his cool, he tells his friend Richard Winters that she was taking everything, including the dog. In the Richard Winters biography, biggest brother Winters said that when they were still stateside, he had been to Nixon's house many times and observed that there was no love in Nixon's married life. Winters then stated that Catherine was just interested in the Nixon millions, and Nix, as a result, lost all faith in women. His drinking was also cited as one of the reasons for their eventual divorce. Lewis Nixon and Richard Winters first met at Army Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning. In the spring of 1942, they formed what would become a lifelong friendship. On the surface, the two couldn't be more opposite. Winters came from a middle-class family, while Nixon's extravagantly wealthy family rubbed elbows with William Randolph Hearst and the Kennedys. Nixon was an alcoholic who liked to hit the town, and Winters didn't drink at all and preferred to stay on the base. Winters explained their friendship in his memoir as follows. Despite our differences in lifestyle, I sense we shared mutual feelings and ways of looking at life. I could understand him and help him understand me as well as understand himself. Our friendship evolved naturally, and he soon became my closest friend. Stephen Ambrose stressed that both men shared a dedication to proficiently executing their assignments as soldiers, and both were highly skilled in their roles. Ambrose stated the following in the Band of Brothers book. Every member of EAS interviewed for this book said, Winters was the best combat commander he ever saw, while Nixon was the most brilliant staff officer he knew in the war. In Richard Winters' memoir, Beyond Band of Brothers, he said that it was at Fort Benning that he knew Lewis Nixon trusted him immensely. While we were in training before we shipped overseas, Nixon hid his entire inventory of VAT 69 blended whiskey in my footlocker, under the tray holding my socks, underwear, and sweaters. What greater trust, what greater honor could I ask for than to be trusted with his precious inventory of that 69? Lewis Nixon's reliance on alcohol grew worse during the war. Not long after, Easy Company fought in the Battle of Coron. On June 12, 1944, Lewis Nixon was moved up from his role as 2nd Battalion Intelligence Officer, or S2, to become the Regimental Intelligence Officer for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. However, over time, the commander of the 5/6th, Colonel Robert Sink, grew tired of Nixon's drinking and wanted to transfer him. It's accurate that Richard Winters convinced Colonel Sink to allow Nixon to remain in the 506th S, instead demoted Nixon from regimental staff back down to battalion staff in the spring of 1945. He would then serve directly under Winters as Operations Officer, or S3, and be mostly out of Sink's hair. It's true that Lewis Nixon had Richard Winters to come to New Jersey after the war was over to work for Nixon. Nitration works the family business. Nixon returned home from Europe in September 1945. As noted at the end of Band of Brothers, Winters took Nixon up on the job offer, and within 2 weeks of Winters returning home, he traveled to New York City to meet Lewis, Nixon's parents. It was then that Nixon's father offered Winters the job. Winters became personnel manager at Nixon Nitration Works working under Lewis, and he was eventually promoted to general manager. Winters worked with Lewis at the company for a total of approximately 6 years, from January 1946 until December 1951. According to the Richard Winters biography, Biggest Brother, Winters wanted to quit because of the family drama, including Lewis's hard-drinking, womanizing father Stanhope Nixon once pointing a gun at him while drunk after Stanhope's mistress called Winters for help. Winters only planned to stay at the company until he found a new job around that same time. Winters was recalled to active duty for Korea. The recall gave Winters an excuse to step away from the company and the drama. Back on active duty, Winters served briefly as a regimental planning and training officer at Fort Dix, New Jersey. As emphasized in the series, he was given the last-minute option to resign from the Army, and he decided not to go to Korea. He'd had enough of war. He did try to return to Nixon Nitration Works in September 1952, but he discovered his position had been filled. Everyone had thought, even Winters himself, that he was going to Korea. It's possible Winters was only looking to return until he found another job. However, it doesn't seem that Lewis Nixon knew that, and it couldn't have been easy for him to have to tell his best friend that his role at the company had been taken. This might explain why Nixon gave Winters 6 months' pay and signed over the company car to him. Nixon felt bad that he was losing his best friend and wanted to help him stay on his feet until he could find a new job. By that point, Winters also had a wife and a 1-year-old son to support. Winters then went back to New Jersey and found a job as a production supervisor with Johnson & Johnson. He ultimately ended up in Pennsylvania, where he had bought a 106-acre farm and built a home there for his family. It is where he would eventually find the peace and quiet that he had promised himself. On DID, having read the stories of so many veterans who struggled with PTSD after the war, and how they held so much of their pain inside, unable to talk about it with their families, it would be hard to overestimate how cathartic it must have been for Lewis Nixon and Richard Winters to have each other in their lives almost on a daily basis in the years immediately following the war, even after Winters left Nixon's family's company and would eventually start his own animal feed business. We know from postcards and letters between the two men and their wives that they always remained good friends. Not all Easy Company veterans were as fortunate. Some returned home and lost touch with the men they'd fought alongside. They bottled everything up, knowing it would be hard for their families and friends to understand. They often used alcohol to numb the pain. This includes Don Malarkey, who spent decades struggling with PTSD only to find some healing after he began to attend Easy Company reunions decades later and reconnect with the men. For Lewis Nixon, he already had had a problem with alcohol before and during the war, and from Winters' account, the problem persisted after they returned home. As Damon Lewis's character states at the end of the series, it's true that Nixon had some tough times. After the war, Lewis Nixon's divorce from his first wife Catherine was finalized in December.